Bad Things starts 3 years in the past on a day which changed the central character's life forever. John Henderson basically witnesses the death of his 4-year-old son, who walks out onto a jetty over a lake on his property and dies. No one knows why. Now, in the present day, John is separated from his wife, living in a different state and carving out a quiet life, working as a waiter, basically trying to forget everything that's happened to him, until one night someone gets in touch with him, a stranger gets in touch with him via email, and with a simple message saying, just, I know what happened. Although he tries to ignore this, John gradually gets pulled back into his old life and eventually back to the small town in Washington State where all this happened, and from there on his life is gradually pulled apart. I became a father 4 years ago, and though there's certainly been no conscious effort to say, well, now I'm a father, I must write about parental things, there's no doubt that it's affected the kind of things that I write about. My previous book, The Intruders, had a child who disappeared in it, and Bad Things is centrally about the death of a child. So I tend to think that any book that's any good tends to be about something that's personal, tends to be slightly autobiographical, and certainly now, as someone who has a son, I do find that issues to do with the kind of things that happen around families and around children have become even more central to what I do. My first 3 novels are, I guess, generally thought of as science fiction. They're certainly found on the science fiction shelves. I didn't really think of them as that way. I think of myself as a suspense writer or a thriller writer. The first 3 books happened to be thrillers set in the future because they were about futuristic conceits like cloning or being able to have other people's dreams. And then when I wrote the Strawman trilogy, that was about serial killers, and not only did that not need to be in the future, it seemed that it would distance the reader from the reality of these crimes and the effects they have on people if they were set in the future. The subsequent books, The Intruders and now Bad Things, also deal with very contemporary concerns or concerns about the past, and so that's why to me they feel much better and more strongly rooted if set in the present day. People often ask me what my favourite books are and what my favourite authors are, and it's a question I find almost impossible to ask, really, because there are so many. I mean, it's easy for me to cite people like Stephen King and Kingsley Amis and Martin Amis and Ray Bradbury, and see, I'm already, there's so many authors just sort of competing for who I should mention next. And I think something that's been both a blessing and a curse in my life is that I like a huge variety of things. It's why I've ended up writing slightly different types of books. It's why I read different type of books. It's why my idea of the perfect meal is a sort of all-you-can-eat buffet. I don't like just sticking to one particular genre, one particular writer. And so I read crime, I read literary fiction, I read horror, science fiction, whatever, really. And because I think a book ends up being more interesting through having all those different influences rather than just being, okay, well, I like crime books, therefore I'm going to write another crime book. I think that way you end up with pretty dull books. I guess I was lucky in a way because my father, although he's not a fiction writer, he's an academic and he writes non-fiction books, and so I was aware from a very early age that books were something that you could make. And my mother taught me to read when I was young, and I realized that actually the simplest, easiest and most enjoyable way of traveling anywhere, to another country, to another world, to being a different age, to being in a different age, was through a book. And they've just never stopped having that fascination for me. I mean, every single book is a gate either to information or to a story or to a different way of looking at things. And as a piece of technology, they're about as perfect as they can get. So that's my excuse anyway for having an awful lot of them.